This video is sponsored by Squarespace. The Mad Max franchise took the cinema industry by storm when it was first released in 1979 and continues today with Furiosa, a Mad Max story, a prequel to 2015's Mad Max Fury Road. But how did this film come together, and how did its production differ from the previous entries? From contrived CGI controversies, go figure, to a 15-minute action sequence that took 78 days to film. Let's get into the production of Furiosa. Furiosa as a project is inherently tied to the film as it acts as a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road. Fury Road is the fourth film in the Mad Max saga, and it has a very long history behind it, with a 15-year cycle of development hell involving economic and political turmoil, as well as personal strife for director George Miller.
I got two-thirds of the way through the story, and I said, oh my God, that's a Mad Max story. And it took another 18 months to get it onto paper, and we were about to shoot it when the Iraqi war started. The American dollar crashed against the Australian dollar. We were going to be making it with Australian dollars.
This meant that rather than being put together fairly quickly as the initial Mad Max trilogy had, Fury Road stewed in Miller's mind for a long time as he worked on other projects, developing detailed outlines on its characters and their styles. One of the key shifts for Fury Road was that Max wouldn't be its only protagonist, with Miller deciding to create Furiosa as a co-protagonist who would drive much of the film, a warrior who searches for her lost clan in a promised land and frees the slaves held hostage by local warlord Immortan Joe. Miller and his co-writer ended up finding the backstory that they had created so compelling that they put together a new narrative with Furiosa as its sole protagonist, before Fury Road had even begun production. This would be a prequel set decades before Fury Road, acting as a kind of origin story for the character, with a far more drawn-out narrative spanning a 15-year time span that Miller ultimately described as an odyssey.
These films are interesting to me because they are allegorical in the same way that, let's say, the American Western movie has been that. It's a more reduced elemental world in which the conflicts are played, or interactions of human beings are played in more extreme situations.
When Miller finally cleared his many other projects off his calendar and plotted a return to Mad Max, he planned to produce Fury Road and Furiosa back to back. We were thinking of making it as an anime, and that's why it was fully developed, partly. But then Fury Road was once again delayed, and there was no point in making an anime. But he eventually pulled back from this idea, and Furiosa was further delayed when Miller and his company sued distributor Warner Brothers for denying them bonuses after the film went over the planned budget, which Miller blamed on Warner's demands for reshoots, while Warner Brothers countered that the changes were actually necessary to keep the budget under control. As this battle rattled on, Miller instead turned to another film of his, the fantasy narrative 3,000 Years of Longing. Eventually the suit was settled, the 3,000 Years project was complete, and Miller returned to Furiosa. One key decision he made in pre-production was that Furiosa would not be played by the same actor who portrayed her in Fury Road, Charlize Theron, as he was put off by how de-aging technology still had an uncanny valley effect he just wasn't comfortable with. So instead, he looked to cast someone new for the character. As a concession to the COVID pandemic, Miller ended up having to hold auditions over Skype, and in that process, Miller found that someone he was looking for, Anya Taylor-Joy. Miller first saw Joy on film while watching an early cut of Last Night in Soho with its director Edgar Wright.
Well, I sing, of course.
As soon as Miller mentioned finding her interesting and that he was looking for someone to play Furiosa, Wright ended up jumping at the chance to recommend her, telling him that she would be great to work with. This prompted Miller to arrange an audition for her, asking her to perform an apocalyptic speech from the 1976 film Network, simply known as I'm Mad as Hell.
I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
After 2 takes, Miller was convinced and sent the audition to the studio to argue for her casting, which they quickly agreed to. Since the main villain of Furiosa's story, Immortan Joe, had his fate sealed in Fury Road, another adversary was in need of casting, the warlord who kidnaps Furiosa and hands her to Joe, with Chris Hemsworth finding himself filling those shoes, tapping to what he called a sense of violent impulsiveness, flamboyance, and stunted growth.
You're trying to tap into the sort of adventurous, the joy, playfulness as a kid when your imagination's allowed to sort of run wild. And that was easier to access with a character that was allowed to break the rules. And so there was one big sort of experiment.
Today's sponsor, Squarespace, has just been updated to Squarespace 7.1 with its powerful Fluid engine and newly added Blueprint AI and SEO tools. It's the easiest way to get a professional website for your business up and running for anyone who doesn't have a lot of time to, mess around with complicated coding. The new Blueprint AI system helps you build your website from the ground up, tailoring it to your specific business and industry. And instead of having to install a bunch of SEO plugins so people actually see your website, the new SEO tools will help you launch your site and get seen fast with integrated and optimized SEO tools that will help your website not get left behind in the dust. So head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial to test out their awesome new features. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/FrameVoyager to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code FrameVoyager. Principal photography would begin on June 1st, 2022 in Australia, a familiar place to the franchise as all of the original films were shot extensively around Australia, especially in the country's crimson sanded deserts. And from the first Mad Max in 1979 throughout its 4-film run leading up to Furiosa, the franchise has been known for its ambitious and at times insane production process. From the original film closing down roads and filming without permits and not using walkie-talkies because they coincided with police radios, to the unique Mad Max Fury Road in 2015 where director George Miller fought to keep everything as practical as possible, saying that 90% of the effects in Mad Max Fury Road were practical. And oddly enough, in an industry that seemingly takes any chance it gets to hide the work of visual effect artists in films, this claim holds some elements of truth to it. With behind the scenes showcasing just how much Fury Road looks the same when you take away the CGI and visual effects from it. That, of course, is not to say that there were no visual effects in this film. In fact, Fury Road was an excellent showcase of how one can combine various aspects of effects work, both practical and digital, and how they can work in tandem towards a common goal. But again, don't let anyone fool you into thinking there weren't any extensive digital effects work littered throughout this previous film. Looking back to Fury Road, we could see quite a lot of digital and visual effects enhancing a mostly practical shot. In other words, the CGI was for the most part invisible, yet it was still very present throughout this entire film. This new entry into the Mad Max universe, however, is an oddly controversial one, at least right now, a little bit before it releases. Reading through comments, Reddit threads, and various other posts online, quite a few other people expressed concerns or disapproval over the visual style of Furiosa, with a common complaint being an alleged over-reliance on CGI, whereas most of the previous movies' effects were achieved practically. But when looking at featurettes for Furiosa right now, we could see quite clearly that the production team had costumes, props, and custom vehicles handy just like all of the other films, which could mean that the production of Furiosa still relied on lots of props and special effects work before any visual effects or compositing projects were even opened. Now, digital doubles and impressive roto work aren't the only components of Mad Max Fury Road's interesting visual identity. Lighting and color grading was heavily stylized for Fury Road 2, and you can kind of feel that a little bit more in Furiosa, as it leans more into the outlandish presentation this time around, significantly ramping up the speed ramps and using many close-up shots, which give some shots a comic book-like flair. Then there's the issue with the trailers. Many times trailers are edited with yet-to-be-finished material, with the effects work not being as polished as it could be. Oftentimes the effects look very different in trailers when compared to their final counterparts when the film was released, and many early viewers of the film agree that the film includes more obvious CGI than Fury Road, but agree that it doesn't detract from the film itself, saying in its best moments, Furiosa puts pretty much every modern superhero movie to shame. And it seems like the movie will be quite similar to Fury Road in some respects, as it will include more insane situations that unfold on screen, such as a 15-minute action sequence that took 78 days to film.
Oh, it was massive. You've been seeing kind of her resourcefulness, yes, throughout the film, but up until that point, you don't really understand that she only ever has to learn something once. You don't understand the level of her resourcefulness, and we kind of used Stowaway as to give you a picture of who this person was, to understand what she had become in the time that she'd been away from the Green Place. And it was an extraordinary sequence to film. We shot it for 78 days. It's over 15 minutes of footage, and it was just wild.
In the past Mad Max films, to orchestrate these complex sequences, director George Miller would work with his team to visualize stunts by physically laying out all of the elements of the sequence in a tent in the desert. We had this massive table out in the middle of the desert with a big tent, and every single stuntman, every single camera, every war boy had a little model. They'd say, okay, you move that way and I move this way, and the camera does this and I get killed and fall off here. All of that had to be worked out shot for shot. Every shot was rehearsed on a toy box. This time around, Miller would utilize new technology, namely Unreal Engine's Previs program, Proxy. It really is a much faster and accurate way to do previs than all of the traditional treatments. We were able to map out every camera move. There's a lot of space to use, it's just not linear. You could do that with storyboards, but it's very hard to figure out how each shot flows into the mix. So that was a perfect tool to do it. Previs can be very painstaking, it's a little like animation, and now the tools are getting way faster. And while it was great to have these new tools to help visualize the sequences and get the planning done ahead of time, the actual filming of a 15-minute action sequence, a sequence that required 200 stunt people on set daily.
So like, I'm gonna be really honest about this. I'm a really good driver. I don't have a license.
The Valiant, I started stunt training with that car. Driving around in that is pretty unbelievable.
No, I had never driven a car in my life.
You had literally never driven a car before?
When
you were in
Miller,
a Mad
when
Max?
George Miller calls you and asks you, do you want to learn how to drive a car to be a Mad Max? You say yes.
George and I would have these big conversations about why this particular set piece was so long. It's because you see an accumulation of skills over the course of a battle, and that's very important for understanding how resourceful Furiosa is, but also her grit. It's the longest sequence any of us have ever shot. It was wild, it was so much fun, but really interesting because it all took place on the war rig. So I had it very mapped out in my head like, okay, I've got a month and a half underneath the rig, a month on the side. Chris Hemsworth actually was able to skip out on the scene, telling them, you guys can have it, go for it. But he did mention being impressed by the scene. The sequence, you can see it. There is an authenticity to it and a grit which is so impressive. So hats off to her and the entire stunt department. But speaking of stunts, you should check out our other video on stunts with the release of The Fall Guy. It was even directed by a stuntman himself, and you could check out that video right here.